When I opened my eyes, I was back on the exact day my twin sister and I chose our husbands. That's when the telepathy started. Outwardly, Isabella played the perfect demure bride. But a vicious, greedy voice crashed straight into my mind. I'm taking the easy brother this time. The empire will be mine. She was frantically stealing my past, thinking she was stealing a crown. I didn't warn her. I just smiled, picked up the gold pen, and calmly signed my name next to the family's coldest executive. The ocean wind howled against the massive glass windows of the Hamptons estate. It was our first night under the same roof. If you have ever watched someone walk willingly into a trap they set for you, tell me where you are listening from today. Isabella thought she had handed me a life sentence of misery by leaving me with Julian. She had no idea she had given me the ultimate shield. Julian sat across the long mahogany table in his private study. He did not offer me a drink. He did not offer me a smile. He simply pushed a thick, leather-bound folder across the polished wood. The contract was precise. Separate bedrooms in opposite wings of the estate. A personal allowance of $2 million a year. Absolutely no interference in his corporate decisions or his private schedule. I picked up the document and read through the clauses with the practiced eye of a chief financial officer. It was not a marriage, it was a corporate merger with clear boundaries. I reached for the pen and signed my initials on every page. Julian watched me with eyes as grey and unreadable as a winter storm, but the silence in the room was an illusion. I focused my mind and let his internal voice filter into my awareness. Just another pawn sent by Margaret. Keep her comfortable, keep her quiet, and she will not be a problem. His thoughts were entirely transactional. There was no malice, no hidden cruelty, and no unpredictable rage. It was pure, unadulterated logic. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, I felt my shoulders drop. I felt an overwhelming sense of safety. Isabella had chosen Caleb because he smiled warmly and whispered sweet promises, completely blind to the rot beneath his charm. I had been married to Caleb in my previous life. I knew exactly what his warmth cost. I closed the folder and slid it back to Julian. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my dress. I wished him a productive evening and turned toward the door. I did not need a husband to love me. I needed a partner who operated on facts, logic, and undeniable written agreements. Love was a liability that could be manipulated. A solid contract was a fortress. I walked down the long, quiet corridor toward my designated wing. The house was entirely silent, save for the distant crashing of the waves. I unpacked my financial ledgers and set up my dual monitors on the desk in my new room. Footsteps broke the morning silence. The sterling Manhattan penthouse buzzed with the low, steady murmur of old money. It was the first formal family gathering since the weddings. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the guests, but the atmosphere was as rigid as a boardroom. Margaret, the matriarch of the Sterling family, sat in her high-backed chair, observing the room with critical eyes. Isabella glided through the crowd, practically radiating triumph. She wore a diamond necklace that caught every flash of light, and Caleb stood close by her side. He played the role of the devoted, gentle husband with sickening perfection. He poured her champagne. He introduced her to board members with a soft, affectionate tone. To the rest of the room, they were the golden couple of the new generation. I stood near the balcony doors, holding a glass of sparkling water, analysing them the way I would analyse a fraudulent balance sheet. The numbers did not add up. I focused my attention on Isabella as Caleb wrapped his arm around her waist for a photograph. Her smile was flawless, but her mind was screaming. Why is he squeezing so hard? It hurts. Please let go. If I flinch, Margaret will notice. Just keep smiling. My grip on my glass tightened slightly. Caleb's public affection was a physical threat, a silent warning delivered right in front of 200 people. Isabella had bought her own nightmare, paying for it with the illusion of control. She wanted the easy path to the sterling fortune. Assuming Caleb's pleasant exterior meant he was weak and manageable, she had never bothered to look at the fine print of his soul. Julian materialized beside me. He did not initiate small talk. He simply stood there, an imposing presence that commanded immediate space. His proximity forced two nosy socialites to change their trajectory and leave me in peace. He did not do it out of affection. He did it because he found idle chatter highly inefficient. I appreciated the silent barrier he provided. I turned my gaze away from Isabella's glittering misery and scanned the perimeter of the room. The catering staff moved with practiced invisibility. But my eyes stopped on one particular figure near the kitchen entrance. It was Cora, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Sterling family for 3 decades. She was carrying a silver tray holding a single porcelain teacup. That cup belonged to Julian. He only drank a specific herbal blend after dinner. Cora's hands were violently shaking. I did not move toward Cora immediately. I stayed perfectly still, leaning slightly against the cold glass of the balcony door, and tuned into the frantic frequency of her mind. I am so sorry, Mr. Julian. God forgive me. If I do not put these 3 drops in the tea tonight, the clinic will throw my grandson out on the street tomorrow. Caleb promised it would only make him tired. He promised. The words hit me like a physical strike, but my expression remained entirely unchanged. Caleb was making his move. He was not waiting for the annual board meeting. He was systematically poisoning Julian using an untraceable liquid, leveraging the desperate love of an old woman to do his dirty work. If Julian fell ill, Caleb, as the next in line, would step in as acting chief executive officer. It was a hostile takeover, masked as a family tragedy. I looked at Julian. He was currently reviewing a digital report on his phone, completely unaware that his trusted housekeeper was carrying a loaded weapon toward him. I set my glass down on a passing waiter's tray and intercepted Cora just as she reached the edge of the dining area. I placed my hand gently but firmly over hers on the silver tray. She flinched, her eyes wide with terror. I kept my voice low, pleasant, and utterly normal. I told her Julian had requested a coffee instead, and that I would take the tea back to the kitchen to dispose of it. Cora stared at me, her mind racing with panic and confusion, but she lacked the authority to argue with the new lady of the house. She surrendered the tray and quickly retreated. I carried the porcelain cup into the nearest private powder room. I locked the heavy oak door. The herbal tea smelled completely normal. No chemical scent, no discoloration. It was a sophisticated, highly expensive compound. I did not pour it down the drain. Instead, I retrieved an empty travel cosmetics bottle from my evening bag, carefully transferred a generous sample of the poisoned liquid into it, and sealed it tight. I dumped the rest into the sink, rinsed the cup thoroughly with hot water, and wiped it perfectly dry. Caleb thought he was playing a game of shadows. He thought he could manipulate the board, poison his brother, and use his new wife as a distraction while he stole the empire. But he had made a critical miscalculation. He had underestimated the woman standing in the background. I dropped the sealed vial into my bag. I did not need to scream or make a public scene. A public accusation without paper trails would only make me look hysterical, and Margaret would swiftly bury the scandal to protect the family name. I needed concrete, undeniable leverage. I needed a better ledger. The quiet hum of the climate control system filled my home office. It was past midnight. The vial of poison tea sat securely locked inside my personal safe. Before I opened my laptop to begin tracing Caleb's financial web, I pulled a small, worn notebook from my bottom drawer. It was an old personal ledger I had kept since childhood. Running my fingers over the faded cover, the memories flooded back, uninvited but necessary. Growing up, our household was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Isabella learned very early that tears were a currency. If she cried loudly enough, she received the new dress, the better bedroom, the immediate attention. I, on the other hand, learned to be silent. I was the understanding one, the responsible one. I remembered the summer I was accepted into an advanced mathematics program. The tuition was expensive. Isabella had simultaneously decided she desperately needed to attend an elite equestrian camp because all her wealthy friends were going. She threw a spectacular tantrum, refusing to eat for 2 days. My parents, exhausted by the noise, turned to me. They asked me to wait another year. They praised my maturity. I surrendered my spot without a tear. Margaret, the sterling matriarch, operated on a very similar frequency. She had always favoured Caleb's mother, and by extension, Caleb, because they played the role of the gentle, accommodating victims perfectly. Julian was too sharp, too independent, too much like a machine. Margaret feared what she could not emotionally control. She praised Isabella's delicate nature and criticized my rigid posture. In my previous life, I had tried to play by their rules. I had tried to be the good, silent wife to Caleb, enduring his psychological torment because I believed endurance would eventually be rewarded with respect. I was wrong. Enduring injustice does not make you a saint. It makes you a permanent target. It only feeds the greed of the people hurting you. I traced a small, faint scar on my left wrist. It was from the day Caleb had thrown a heavy glass paperweight during one of his unseen rages in my past life. I had covered it with makeup. I had hidden the truth to protect the family image. That silence had ultimately cost me everything. I closed the old notebook and shoved it back into the drawer. The girl who suffered in silence was dead. The woman sitting in this chair was a chief financial officer, and I was about to audit Caleb Sterling's entire existence. He wanted to play with human lives to secure a corporate throne. I would dismantle his throne document by document. I powered on my dual monitors. The screens illuminated the dark room. I had work to do. The soft glow of the monitors reflected off my glasses. To defeat Caleb, I could not just attack his front line. I had to sever his supply chains. Right now, his most crucial supply chain was Cora. He held the life of her grandson hostage to ensure the poison kept flowing into Julian's cup. I logged into a highly secure, heavily encrypted private terminal. I did not use the Sterling corporate network. I used the independent wealth I had quietly accumulated over the past decade through aggressive, anonymous investments. Tracing Caleb's leverage was offensively easy once I knew where to look. He was not paying the hospital directly. He was routing payments through a charitable foundation under his name, specifically earmarked for a private pediatric care facility in upstate New York. It was a brilliant public relations move that doubled as an extortion tool. If Cora failed to deliver the drops, the foundation's grant would be instantly revoked, and a disabled child would be discharged within 24 hours. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I kept strictly memorized. It belonged to a premier medical logistics firm I had retained during my days managing aggressive corporate acquisitions. They handled quiet, high-stakes relocations for executives. I ordered an immediate, specialized medical transport. I instructed them to arrive at the upstate facility at exactly 2 a.m. Using my private funds, I established an irrevocable medical trust in the boy's name, fully funded for the next 15 years. I paid the premium facility out of pocket, securing his new placement under a completely different corporate umbrella, miles away from Caleb's influence. I watched the digital progress on my second monitor. The logistics team bypassed the front desk protocols using the overwhelming force of top-tier legal retainers and immediate wire transfers. Cash clears doors faster than threats. I listened to the silence of the Hamptons' house. I did not go to Cora's room to demand her loyalty. I did not want her gratitude or her tears. I needed her to be absolutely free from fear, so she could be a credible, unshakable witness when the time came. A witness motivated by fear can be broken by a better threat. A witness freed from chains is unbreakable. At exactly 3:14 in the morning, a secure text message appeared on my screen. It contained only 2 words: transfer complete. The boy was safe. The medical trust was locked. Caleb's invisible gun had just been emptied, and he did not even know his finger was resting on a dead trigger. I deleted the encrypted logs and closed the terminal. The screen went completely dark. The heavy oak doors of Julian's private study were slightly ajar. I walked in, carrying a stack of financial portfolios. The room smelled of old paper and cedar. It was a space strictly forbidden to Isabella in my previous life. But I was not here as a wife. I was here as the chief financial officer of the Sterling Empire. I set the folders on the massive desk and began sorting through the quarterly projections. Julian was supposed to be at a summit in the city, but the distinct sound of leather shoes against the hardwood floor announced his early return. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the sight of me standing behind his desk. I did not flinch. I did not apologize for entering his sanctuary. I simply looked up and met his gaze. I tapped the top folder. I told him the commercial real estate projections were flawed, and I needed access to his personal ledgers to cross-reference a set of highly specific tax liabilities. He walked slowly into the room. He did not yell. He did not demand I leave. Julian operated on efficiency. He stood beside me, examining the numbers I had highlighted. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. I focused my mind and let his internal voice filter through. She sees the discrepancy. Margaret's pawn is surprisingly sharp, but she cannot know about the silver key. She cannot know what my grandfather left in the wall safe. I kept my breathing perfectly even. The silver key, a hidden wall safe. Julian was guarding something far more significant than standard corporate ledgers. His grandfather, the founder of the Sterling Empire, had clearly left behind a contingency plan, and Julian was protecting it with his life. He reached across the desk, his arm brushing lightly against mine, and typed a complex password into his terminal. He granted me the ledger access I requested without a single word of hesitation. Trust was not built through emotional declarations in this house. Trust was built through competence and unshakable composure. I thanked him formally and gathered my files. I knew I had to find that silver key, not to steal it, but to understand the full board of the game Caleb was trying to hijack. If Caleb succeeded in his slow poisoning, whatever that key unlocked would fall directly into his greedy hands. I returned to my own wing and immediately pulled up the newly decrypted ledgers. Julian's personal finances were impeccably clean, organized down to the final cent. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic, debt-ridden accounts I had managed for Caleb in my past life. But as I scrolled through the corporate expense accounts linked to the secondary branches of the family, a strange sequence of numbers caught my attention. It was buried deep within the maintenance costs for a subsidiary warehouse facility in New Jersey. The anomaly glared on the screen. I spent the next 4 hours dissecting the anomaly. A good chief financial officer does not just look at where the money goes, she looks at how the money tries to hide. The payments were authorized under a generic vendor code. They occurred exactly on the 15th of every month, totaling precisely $12,500 each time. It was too regular for basic maintenance and too small to trigger an executive audit. I traced the vendor's tax identification number through 3 different state registries until I finally hit the bedrock. It was a shell company. And the primary commodity purchased by this company was not office supplies or cleaning services. It was a highly restricted industrial chemical compound, one that contained lethal, untraceable levels of heavy metals if ingested consistently over time. Caleb was not buying poison in dark alleyways. He was using the family's own money, routed through a fake corporate entity, to slowly murder his brother. It was arrogant, sloppy, and entirely characteristic of a man who believed his charm made him invisible to scrutiny. The next morning, I attended the monthly executive briefing at the Sterling headquarters in Manhattan. I sat 3 chairs down from Caleb. He was dressed in an immaculate navy suit, leaning forward and speaking passionately about family unity and corporate responsibility. He smiled at Julian, offering him a glass of water from the carafe on the table. I watched the exchange with an icy detachment. I focused my attention sharply on Caleb's smiling face and listened. "Drink it. Julian, look at how pale you are. 3 more months. Just 3 more months, and your nervous system will collapse completely. Then, the empire is mine." My pulse did not spike. My hands did not shake. I did not leap across the table to knock the glass away. Instead, I carefully documented the name of the shell company in my encrypted digital notes. Caleb thought he was a master strategist, orchestrating a brilliant tragedy. He did not realize his entire operation was currently being mapped, highlighted, and archived by the woman sitting quietly at the end of the mahogany table. He caught me looking at him. He flashed me that signature, warm smile, the one Isabella had thrown away her future to secure. I smiled back. It was a perfectly polite, entirely hollow expression. I let him believe he was winning. Let him believe the shadows were protecting him. I would cut the line. I could not simply order Cora to stop serving the tea. If Caleb realized his supply chain had been severed, he would panic. A panicked enemy is unpredictable. He might switch to a faster, more violent method. I had to create a buffer. That evening, I intercepted the household staff schedule. I issued a new dietary directive under the guise of an elite nutritional protocol I had supposedly hired a private consultant to design for the executive team. I mandated that all evening beverages for the CEO must be prepared using a specific, highly supervised boiling method in the secondary kitchen, which I personally oversaw. Cora still prepared the tray. She still carried the cup. But the liquid inside was now a harmless, premium herbal blend I had imported directly from London. The poisoned drops were being disposed of safely into a chemical waste container I kept locked in my private bathroom. 3 weeks passed. The subtle changes in Julian were undeniable. The grey pallor in his complexion began to fade. The fractional hesitation in his speech during long meetings completely disappeared. He was regaining his vital energy, piece by piece. One evening, I brought a stack of audit reports into his study. He was standing by the window, looking out at the dark ocean. He turned when I entered. He did not immediately reach for the reports. Instead, his gaze lingered on me, assessing and calculating. The severe headaches have stopped. The fatigue is gone. It started the exact day she overhauled the kitchen protocols. She knows something. She is controlling the environment. I maintained eye contact. I knew he was analyzing the variables, and I knew I was the only variable that had changed. I set the folders on his desk. I told him the audit on the New Jersey subsidiary would be completed by Friday. I did not mention the poison. I did not ask for his gratitude. I simply gave him the data he required and turned to leave. He did not stop me. He let me walk away, but the heavy silence in the room felt different. It was no longer the silence of two strangers trapped in a contract. It was the silence of two people standing on the same side of an invisible battlefield. I walked back to my wing, my mind already calculating the next phase of the audit. I needed the final piece of physical evidence to lock Caleb's fate permanently. Cora stood in the doorway. Cora looked smaller than usual, her shoulders hunched beneath her neat uniform. She stepped into my room before I could speak and softly closed the door behind her. She did not say a word at first. She simply reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, dark amber glass vial. She placed it on my desk. Next to it, she set down a small, worn leather notebook. I looked at the objects, then up at her face. Her eyes were red, swollen from tears she had clearly been shedding in secret. I focused my mind. The hospital called. They said an anonymous benefactor moved my grandson to the premier facility in the state. The trust fund is locked for 15 years. Caleb cannot touch him anymore. She did this. The new Mrs. Sterling did this. I did not offer her a warm hug or a display of dramatic emotion. Calmness was the only language that commanded true respect. I pulled out a chair and gestured for her to sit. She sank into it, her hands trembling in her lap. "I know what is in the vial, Cora," I said, my voice steady and completely level. "And I know who ordered you to use it." She let out a quiet, broken sob. She confessed everything. She detailed how Caleb had cornered her in the pantry 6 months ago, holding the medical bills for her grandson. She explained how he had provided the drops, instructing her to add exactly 3 to Julian's evening tea. The notebook contained the dates, times, and exact dosage she had administered under Caleb's direct threats. "I am a terrible woman," she whispered, covering her face. "I traded one life for another." I reached across the desk and gently pulled her hands away from her face. "You were a hostage," I corrected her. "Hostages do not make choices. They survive. But you are no longer a hostage." I pushed a blank sheet of high-grade stationery across the desk, followed by my pen. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the absolute authority of a woman who had already won the war. "You do not owe me your life, Cora," I stated clearly. "You owe me the truth. I need you to write down exactly what you just told me, sign it, and date it." She did not hesitate. She picked up the pen and wrote the confession with a steady hand. When she finished, I locked the vial, the notebook, and the written statement into my secure safe. The physical evidence was now perfectly aligned with the financial paper trail. The enemy changed his strategy. The third quarter closed, and Julian was supposed to be bedridden. According to Caleb's calculated timeline, the heavy metal toxicity should have compromised Julian's central nervous system by now. Instead, Julian had just finalized a massive overseas acquisition, working 16-hour days with ruthless efficiency. I observed Caleb during the weekly family dinner at Margaret's estate. He was sitting across from Julian, slicing into a piece of steak with unnecessary force. The charming, easygoing mask was starting to slip. Why isn't he sick? The dosage was correct. I checked the logs. Why is he perfectly fine? The board meeting is in 4 weeks. I need him incapacitated by the board meeting. Caleb's internal voice was frantic, a sharp contrast to the polite smile he offered Margaret when she asked about his golf game. Panic is the enemy of strategy. When a man like Caleb panics, he makes careless financial decisions. Over the next few days, I monitored the stock movements on my encrypted terminal. Caleb had quietly initiated a series of aggressive, highly leveraged stock purchases, trying to buy out the minority shareholders of the Sterling Corporation. He was attempting to secure a majority voting bloc to force Julian out during the upcoming meeting, just in case the poison failed. To fund these massive purchases, he was draining capital from the shell company, the very same shell company that was legally registered under Isabella's name. He was essentially building his empire on a bridge rigged with explosives, and he had tied his wife directly to the detonator. If the SEC or the authorities ever looked into the funding, Isabella would face federal prison for corporate fraud and embezzlement. Caleb would simply claim ignorance. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing numbers. Isabella had mocked my quiet life. She had pranced around in her diamonds, fully convinced she had stolen the ultimate prize. She had no idea she was legally bound to a man who viewed her as nothing more than a convenient human shield. My phone buzzed on the desk, vibrating against the wood. I picked it up. It was a calendar notification. The annual Sterling Foundation Charity Gala was scheduled for the coming weekend. It was the largest social event of the year, a night where every smile was photographed and every whisper was recorded. A heavy envelope was delivered. The heavy envelope contained the platinum-edged invitation to the Sterling Foundation Charity Gala. It was the absolute pinnacle of the New York social season. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art had been transformed into a glittering sea of old money and corporate influence. Flashbulbs from the press line illuminated the entrance, capturing the forced smiles of the city's most powerful families. I arrived with Julian. We walked the red carpet with the synchronized precision of 2 executives executing a merger. We did not hold hands. We did not stage an elaborate display of fake romance. We simply moved together, a united, unbreakable front. The press noted our cold elegance, interpreting it as the ultimate expression of untouchable high society. Inside the ballroom, The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the guests. Waiters navigated the crowd with trays of expensive champagne. I stood near a massive floral arrangement, analysing the room. Isabella made her entrance 20 minutes later. She was draped in a breathtaking emerald silk gown, heavily adorned with the sterling family diamonds. She laughed loudly at a joke made by a prominent senator, leaning into Caleb's side. To the untrained observer, she was the absolute picture of a victorious woman who had successfully secured her fairy tale ending. But a good chief financial officer never looks at the gross revenue. She looks at the hidden liabilities. I noticed the sleeves of Isabella's gown. The design was modern and sleek, but the long, tight sleeves extended all the way past her wrists, pinned securely with diamond clasps. It was an unusually conservative choice for a woman who thrived on displaying her physical assets. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and focused my mind on my sister. The static of the crowded room faded away, replaced by the chaotic, terrifying frequency of Isabella's internal thoughts. If I raise my arm too high, the fabric will shift. He promised the makeup would cover the bruise. But what if the lights hit it wrong? Why did he have to grab me so hard? I just asked a simple question about the bank accounts. I just wanted to know. I have to keep smiling. Margaret is watching. My expression remained entirely blank. The glittering diamonds around Isabella's neck were not a crown. They were a collar. Caleb's public warmth was a carefully constructed mask designed to hide his private brutality. He was applying physical and psychological pressure to maintain absolute control over his new wife, punishing her whenever she dared to question his financial movements. She had traded her future for a monster wrapped in a tailored suit. She was suffocating under the weight of her own terrible choice, terrified that the world would discover her fairy tale was actually a nightmare. Isabella caught my eye from across the room. Her fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She whispered something to Caleb, detached herself from his side, and began walking directly toward me. Her steps were unsteady. Isabella stopped 3 feet away from me, up close. The meticulous layers of expensive foundation could not hide the exhaustion in her eyes. The emerald silk of her gown rustled softly as she crossed her arms. A defensive posture masked as casual elegance. "You look terribly stiff tonight. Olivia," she said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "But I suppose that is to be expected. Julian abandoned you by the floral arrangements the moment you walked in. It must be so exhausting, pretending to be a wife to a man who treats you like an employee." I did not react. I did not defend my marriage, nor did I point out that Julian was currently securing a critical international supply chain with a foreign minister across the room. I simply looked at her. Her mind was a loud, desperate echo chamber. "Tell me you are miserable. Please, Olivia, tell me you regret it. I need to know I won. I need to know this pain is worth it. If you are happy, then what is happening to me?" This was the invisible chain of a survivor who refused to heal. Isabella was entirely trapped in a prison of her own making. She had spent her entire childhood, both in this life and the previous one, measuring her worth by how much she could take away from me. The psychological trap of normalization had ruined her, because Margaret had always rewarded her tears and validated her victimhood. Isabella believed that enduring abuse was simply the price of power. She could not leave Caleb. To leave him would require admitting she had made a catastrophic mistake. It would require confessing that her grand theft of my destiny had only resulted in her own destruction. Her ego could not survive that collapse. So, she chose to sink deeper into the mud, desperately trying to drag me down with her to validate her suffering. "Julian and I have a clear understanding," I said, my tone perfectly polite and utterly unbothered. "Clarity provides a very peaceful life." Isabella's jaw tightened. The thought of peace was entirely foreign to her. She wanted me to scream. She wanted a dramatic confrontation right here in the ballroom. She wanted the validation of my jealousy. I gave her nothing. I did not pity her, and I certainly did not intend to save her. I had offered her the truth in our past life, and she had pushed me off a roof for it. In this life, she was fully welcome to the ending she had so ruthlessly stolen. "Enjoy your diamonds, Isabella," I said smoothly, turning my attention back to the crowd. "They suit you." She stood there for a moment, completely paralyzed by my indifference. She could not fight an enemy who refused to enter the ring. My phone vibrated twice. The emergency board meeting was called for Tuesday morning. The air in the corporate conference room was incredibly thin. 20 of the most powerful shareholders in the Sterling Empire sat around the massive glass table. Margaret sat at the far end, her hands resting calmly on her silver-handled cane. Caleb stood at the front of the room. He had bypassed the standard agenda, projecting a series of highly manipulated charts onto the main screen. He looked around the room, his face a perfect canvas of deep, brotherly concern. "We must address the reality of the situation," Caleb said, his voice soft but carrying easily across the silent room. "Over the past quarter, Julian's health has visibly deteriorated. We have all seen the missed meetings, the fatigue, the lapses in judgment regarding the European expansion. I love my brother, but the stability of this empire must come before pride. He was executing his coup. He was using the symptoms of the poison he had orchestrated, which I had secretly neutralized weeks ago as the foundation for his corporate takeover. He proposed a temporary, indefinite suspension of Julian's executive powers, citing a medical crisis. I sat 3 seats to Julian's right, my laptop open. My fingers flew across the keyboard, recording every single lie Caleb spoke. They are buying it. Margaret is nodding. Once they vote for the medical suspension, I will assume temporary control. A temporary transition always becomes permanent. I just need a simple majority. Caleb's internal voice was practically singing with arrogant victory. He had spent weeks buying up minority shares through his shell companies to guarantee the vote today. He thought the math was entirely in his favor. I glanced at Julian. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table. His face was a mask of cold stone. He did not interrupt Caleb. He did not shout indignities or demand loyalty from the board. He simply let his brother continue to dig the grave deeper and deeper. I moved to invoke the emergency medical transition clause, Caleb concluded, placing both hands on the table and looking directly at Julian. "For your own good, Julian, step down." The room held its breath. The older board members shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs. Margaret looked at Julian, her expression completely unreadable. Julian slowly unclasped his hands. He looked at Caleb, then at the projected charts, and finally at the board. "I appreciate your deep concern, Caleb," Julian said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Then, Julian deliberately closed his eyes, pressed 2 fingers to his temple, and swayed slightly in his chair. He braced his hand against the glass table, executing a perfectly calculated physical stumble. The meeting was abruptly adjourned. I retreated to my private office on the 42nd floor. The emergency meeting had been suspended for 24 hours to allow the legal team to review Caleb's formal motion. The entire corporate headquarters was buzzing with panicked whispers about the CEO's failing health. I locked my door and pulled up the urgent message my lawyer had sent during the charity gala. It was the final certified audit report on the New Jersey subsidiary and the shell companies funneling money to the chemical supplier. If you have ever realized the person trying to destroy you is actually destroying themselves, drop a comma in the comments. I opened the heavily encrypted PDF file. I scrolled past the routing numbers, the wire transfer authorizations, and the offshore holding accounts. I was looking for the ultimate beneficiary. I was looking for the legally binding signature that authorized the creation of the corporate entity purchasing the heavy metals. The screen illuminated the final page. It was not Caleb's signature. It was Isabella's. My eyes scanned the documentation with clinical precision. Caleb had completely insulated himself. He had used his charm to convince Isabella to sign a mountain of routine tax documents shortly after their wedding, because she was so desperate to feel like a powerful corporate wife. She had signed everything without reading a single clause. Isabella Sterling was now the sole legal owner of the shell company buying lethal chemicals. She was the one funding the attempted murder of the chief executive officer. Caleb had built an untraceable firewall, and his own wife was the primary target if the authorities ever breached the perimeter. I sat back in my leather chair, letting the sheer magnitude of Caleb's cruelty wash over me. He had planned this from the very beginning. Even on the day we chose our husbands, he already knew he needed a naive, ambitious woman to serve as his ultimate scapegoat. Isabella thought she had stolen a crown, but she had actually volunteered for the guillotine. I did not feel a shred of pity. My sister had made her choices with open eyes and a dark heart. I carefully downloaded the entire audit report onto a secure, encrypted flash drive. I added the toxicology reports, the chemical invoices, and Cora's signed, sworn confession. The weapon was fully assembled. The trap was perfectly set. A heavy lock clicked. Julian stepped into the room. Julian closed the heavy frosted glass door behind him. He did not look tired. He did not look like a man whose nervous system was failing. The calculated stumble in the boardroom had been a brilliant theatrical performance, designed entirely to force Caleb to play his final hand. He walked over to my desk and stood looking down at me. The silence in the room was dense, vibrating with unspoken variables. The board is preparing to vote on my removal tomorrow morning, Julian said, his voice low and incredibly calm. Caleb believes he has the shares to force the medical transition. He does not have the shares, I replied smoothly, because the shares he purchased were funded by criminal fraud. I reached into my drawer and pulled out the thick black folder I had prepared. I placed it squarely in the center of my desk. I did not slide it toward him. I simply let it rest there, a physical manifestation of absolute truth. This is a complete forensic audit of the New Jersey subsidiary. I began, using the exact tone I used for quarterly earnings reports. It details a shell company, registered under Isabella's name, that has been purchasing industrial-grade heavy metals for the past 6 months. Included is a toxicology report confirming those exact metals were present in your bloodstream. Also included is a sworn, signed confession from Cora, detailing how Caleb blackmailed her into administering the chemical into your evening tea. Julian stared at the black folder. He did not immediately open it. He did not gasp or express profound shock. He was a man of logic, and the logic had just been handed to him on a silver platter. I focused my mind, breaking through his icy exterior to hear the raw frequency of his thoughts. She knew. She saw the trap closing around my throat, and she systematically dismantled it in the dark. She took the poison out of my cup. She took a knife for me, and she never even asked for the credit. For the first time since I had met Julian Sterling in either lifetime, his internal voice was not calculating a corporate strategy. It was vibrating with a profound, almost overwhelming realization of loyalty. "You changed the kitchen protocols 3 weeks ago," he said, finally looking up from the folder to meet my eyes. "I prefer my executives fully functional," I replied. Holding his gaze without a trace of hesitation, Julian looked at me for a very long moment. The invisible wall of ice that constantly surrounded him seemed to fracture, just a fraction of an inch, revealing the intense, focused gravity of the man beneath. He reached into his pocket. Julian withdrew a small, intricately carved silver key from his interior suit pocket. He did not hand it to me. Instead, he walked past my desk and moved toward the far wall of my private office. His fingers pressed against a specific sequence of wooden panels hidden within the mahogany wainscoting. A subtle click echoed through the room, and a section of the wall slid open to reveal a modern biometric steel safe. He keyed in a numeric code, pressed his thumb against the scanner, and finally inserted the silver key. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside rested a single, thick envelope sealed with dark red wax bearing the original Sterling crest. Julian pulled the envelope out and placed it on my desk, right next to my forensic audit report. "My grandfather built this empire from nothing," Julian said, his voice quiet but echoing with immense respect. He knew exactly what the secondary branches of this family were capable of. He knew Caleb's father was greedy, and he suspected Caleb would inherit that exact same hunger. Before he died, he told me that the CEO title was only a temporary shield. The real armor was inside this envelope. I reached out and carefully broke the wax seal. I slid the heavy, aged parchment onto the glass surface of my desk. It was an elaborate legal document, drafted by 3 separate premier law firms. I scanned the dense legal terminology, my eyes flying over the clauses and stipulations. My breath hitched for a fraction of a second. The only physical reaction I allowed myself. The document was a masterclass in wealth preservation. Grandfather Sterling had not just left Julian the chief executive officer position. He had established a highly restrictive, ironclad financial vehicle protecting exactly 51% of the core corporate shares. It was an absolute control block, shielding the true power of the Sterling Empire from any board vote, any hostile takeover, and any sudden medical transition clause. I looked up at Julian, my mind rapidly calculating the sheer brilliance of the dead man's strategy. "He locked the majority shares," I stated, tracing the final signature line. "Caleb can buy all the minority stock he wants. He can manipulate the board members. He can even try to force a medical resignation. But it does not matter. He cannot touch the core equity." Julian nodded slowly, his eyes locked onto mine, a deep, silent understanding passing between us. He had carried the weight of this secret alone for years, waiting for the inevitable moment Caleb would strike. But as I read the final stipulation at the bottom of the page, a genuine, undeniable smile touched the corners of my mouth. Grandfather Sterling had added one final, brilliant failsafe. The trust was entirely immovable. But releasing its dividends or transferring its authority required two specific signatures. One belonged to Julian, the other belonged to his legally wedded wife. I was the final lock. A slow smile appeared. I sat down and spread the pages of the trust document across my desk. If you believe in fighting battles with facts instead of shouting, let me know you are still here. Caleb had spent months playing a complicated game of chess, blissfully unaware that Julian and I were operating on an entirely different board. This is an irrevocable trust, I explained, running my pen under the primary legal clause. It is exactly what the name implies. Once it is established and funded, it cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the explicit, notarized permission of the designated beneficiaries. It completely removes the assets from your taxable estate and places them out of reach of creditors, board members, and hostile family members. Julian leaned against the edge of my desk, listening intently. The cold, mechanical CEO was now looking at me as an equal partner. Caleb assumes that corporate bylaws dictate power. I continued, keeping my voice methodical and clear. He believes that if he can prove you are medically unfit to lead, the board can vote to transfer the voting rights to him as the next of kin. But corporate bylaws cannot override an irrevocable trust. A board vote is merely a polite suggestion compared to this. I tapped the paper. Even if Caleb brought in a judge, a federal investigator, and the entire board of directors, they cannot touch the 51% control block. Furthermore, any power of attorney document Caleb tries to manufacture to seize your medical or financial rights would instantly bounce off this trust. The law explicitly protects these shares from exactly this kind of predatory maneuvering. She understands it perfectly, Julian thought, his internal voice resonating with deep satisfaction. She is a weapon crafted from logic. Caleb has liquidated his personal assets to buy those minority shares. I concluded, closing the folder with a sharp snap. He has funded an attempted murder using his own wife's signature. And he is about to walk into a boardroom to demand a throne that legally does not exist. Julian stood up straight, adjusting his suit jacket. The board meeting is at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. He will make his move to suspend my executive authority. Let him make it, I replied, standing up to meet his height. We will let him present his entire case to the shareholders. We will let him stand at the head of the table and claim his victory. And then we will present our audit. I locked the trust documents, the toxicology reports, and Cora's sworn affidavit back into my secure safe. I did not feel fear. I felt the profound, cold clarity of a predator watching its prey step willingly into an inescapable snare. Isabella had wanted the easy path to power. Caleb had wanted the empire. Tomorrow, they would both receive the exact bill for their ambitions. The sun began to rise. The executive boardroom on the 50th floor was freezing. The air conditioning hummed softly, doing nothing to cut the suffocating tension in the room. 20 of the most influential shareholders sat around the massive glass table, their faces grim and expectant. At the far end, Margaret sat perfectly straight, holding her silver cane, her eyes fixed on the empty chair at the head of the table. Caleb stood near the presentation screen. He was wearing his best charcoal suit, his face sculpted into a mask of deep, agonizing sorrow. Isabella sat in the chair directly to his right, wearing a severe black dress, trying her hardest to look like the solemn wife of a rising king. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy double doors opened. Julian walked in. He did not look tired. He did not stumble. He moved with the precise, intimidating grace of a predator, claiming its territory. I walked half a step behind him, carrying a single, thick black folder. I did not look at Isabella. I did not acknowledge Caleb. I simply took my designated seat as the chief financial officer. The silence in the room was absolute. Julian took his seat at the head of the table. He folded his hands and looked directly at his brother. "You called an emergency meeting? Caleb, the floor is yours." Caleb cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. He pressed a button on a small remote, illuminating the large screen behind him with medical charts and erratic financial projections. He is trying to look strong. It does not matter. The poison is already in his brain. The board has already seen the erratic stock dips. I have them all in my pocket. Caleb's thoughts were vibrating with arrogant certainty. He began to speak, his voice echoing with calculated grief. He addressed the board, outlining Julian's supposed physical decline, his sudden disappearances from the office, and the potential risk to the shareholders' dividends. He spun a beautiful, tragic narrative about a brilliant man losing his mental faculties, requiring a loving brother to step in and save the family legacy. Isabella dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She was playing her part perfectly, completely unaware of the invisible crosshairs trained directly on her forehead. "Therefore," Caleb concluded, his voice heavy with fake reluctance, "I am asking this board to vote on a temporary suspension of Julian Sterling's executive powers, effective immediately, pending a full medical evaluation." Murmurs rippled through the shareholders. A few older men nodded in solemn agreement. Margaret lowered her eyes, a silent endorsement of the coup. Caleb stood tall, waiting for the vote to commence. I opened the black folder on my desk. The sound of the thick paper turning cut through the murmurs like a gunshot. I did not raise my voice, but when I spoke, the entire room froze. Caleb cleared his throat. "Before we proceed to a vote regarding executive transition," I said, my tone as flat and clinical as a bank auditor reading a penalty notice, "it is my fiduciary duty to present the board with an urgent forensic audit regarding a massive fiscal liability." I signaled my assistant, who immediately began distributing sealed copies of the audit report to every shareholder at the table. Caleb's polite smile faltered slightly. "What is she doing? She is just an accountant. Margaret told me she was a timid little pawn." "Over the past 6 months," I continued, ignoring Caleb's glare, "exactly $12,500 has been diverted from the New Jersey subsidiary on the 15th of every month. The funds were routed to an offshore shell company." Caleb let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Olivia, a discrepancy of $75,000 over 6 months is an accounting error. It is hardly a matter for an emergency board meeting. You are wasting our time to protect a sick man." I did not blink. I tapped the second page of my report. "I completely agree that the amount is trivial for a corporation of this size. The liability does not lie in the dollar amount. The liability lies in the commodity purchased." I looked directly at Caleb. The shell company was purchasing industrial-grade heavy metals, highly toxic, strictly regulated compounds. The murmurs around the table abruptly ceased. Margaret's head snapped up. "Furthermore," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the dead silence, "the shell company was not registered by an anonymous vendor. The incorporation documents, the wire transfer authorizations, and the offshore tax filings were all signed by a single individual." I turned my gaze slowly toward my sister. Isabella was staring at the documents in front of her, her face draining of all colour. "The sole legal proprietor of the shell company purchasing lethal chemicals is Isabella Sterling," I announced. Isabella gasped, dropping her silk handkerchief. "What? No, I never bought anything, Caleb. Tell them." Caleb's face tightened. The mask of the grieving brother vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating survival instinct of a cornered rat. He stepped away from Isabella, his expression hardening into disgusted shock. "She found the shell. She found the signature. I have to cut the dead weight right now." "Isabella," Caleb said, his voice loud and incredibly sharp. "What have you done? Have you been embezzling from my family?" Isabella's jaw dropped. The ultimate betrayal crashed into her. The man she had stolen, the man she had allowed to bruise her and humiliate her for the sake of power, was now feeding her directly to the wolves to save his own skin. "I signed tax papers," she screamed, her voice shrill with terror. "He told me they were tax papers." "I am deeply sorry, Julian," Caleb said quickly, turning to the board. "My wife's financial crimes will be handled by the authorities immediately, but this does not change the fact that you are medically unfit to lead." The heavy doors opened. A tall man in a pristine white coat strode into the boardroom. He carried a leather briefcase and an air of manufactured clinical authority. Caleb immediately gestured toward him, moving swiftly to regain control of the narrative. "This is Dr. Aris Thorne," Caleb announced, his voice regaining its practiced, booming confidence. "He is one of the premier neurologists on the East Coast. I retained his services independently to evaluate Julian's erratic behavior. Isabella's unfortunate embezzlement is a separate legal matter. Julian's decaying mind is an immediate corporate crisis." Isabella was still weeping silently in her chair, utterly ignored by her husband and the rest of the board. The shareholders shifted their attention to the doctor. "Doctor," Thorne opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of medical charts. "Based on observational data, third-party behavioral reports, and an analysis of Mr. Sterling's recent public appearances, I have concluded that he is suffering from early-onset neurological decay, accompanied by severe paranoia and cognitive failure." "Perfect," Caleb thought, his internal voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "The board trusts a white coat. They trust a medical professional over a spreadsheet. Julian looks pale enough to make it believable. I win. Julian is no longer capable of making rational decisions," Caleb stated, placing both hands flat on the glass table. "He is sick. He needs care, not a corporation. I have prepared a legal transition of power document. For the sake of the Sterling Empire, the board must ratify it immediately." Several board members began to nod slowly. Margaret leaned forward, her silver cane tapping lightly against the floor. The illusion of a medical crisis was powerful, and Caleb had framed himself perfectly as the reluctant savior. I looked at Dr. Thorne. I did not argue with his medical jargon. I did not shout that he was a paid actor performing a script. Arguing with a liar only validates their premise. You do not debate a lie, you simply obliterate it with a larger truth. I slowly stood up. The soft rustle of my suit was the only sound in the room. I picked up the third folder from my stack. It was a bright, glaring red. Doctor, Thorne is providing a diagnosis based on observational data, I said, my voice echoing clearly off the glass walls. Observation is subjective. Chemical analysis is absolute. I pulled out a single sheet of paper bearing the official watermark of the most rigorous independent toxicology laboratory in New York State. I did not look at Caleb. I looked directly at Margaret, addressing the true center of the family's ancient power structure. This is a certified blood panel, I stated. I opened the folder. This blood panel was drawn directly from Julian Sterling 72 hours ago. I continued, my voice measured and unyielding. It does not indicate neurological decay. It indicates severe, systematic heavy metal poisoning. Specifically, a rare industrial compound matching the exact chemical signature of the materials purchased by the shell company. A collective gasp echoed around the long glass table. Doctor? Thorne froze, his fake charts suddenly looking very heavy in his hands. My husband is not suffering from a disease, I declared, dropping the toxicology report onto the center of the table. He has been the victim of a premeditated, ongoing assassination attempt. Caleb's face turned an ugly shade of grey. No, she cannot prove the link. She has Isabella's signature on the shell company. She can only prove Isabella bought it. Not me. I heard his desperate internal scramble. He was clinging to his firewall. He thought Isabella would take the fall for the murder attempt as well as the fraud. I pulled out the final document from my red folder. It was several pages long, written on heavy, expensive stationery. To bridge the gap between the chemical purchase and the poison in the CEO's bloodstream, we require a delivery mechanism, I said, holding the document up for the board to see. This is a sworn, notarized affidavit from Cora, the head housekeeper of the Sterling estate. She has served this family for 30 years. Margaret's eyes widened in genuine shock. She knew Cora. Everyone knew Cora. In this affidavit, I read, my voice devoid of mercy. Cora details how Caleb Sterling cornered her in the estate pantry. He explicitly threatened to revoke the specialized medical funding for her disabled grandson unless she administered exactly 3 drops of a provided chemical into Julian Sterling's evening tea. She kept the vial. She kept a daily log of the dosages. Both the vial and the log have been surrendered to private investigators. I tossed the affidavit onto the table, letting it slide directly until it stopped inches from Caleb's trembling hands. This is not a medical transition, I announced to the silent, horrified board of directors. This is an attempted murder, and the perpetrator is standing right here in this room. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. It was the crushing weight of reality descending upon a room built entirely on illusions. Isabella covered her mouth, her eyes wide with terror, as she fully realized the monster she had married. The board members stared at Caleb, their expressions morphing from polite concern to profound disgust. He had tried to steal an empire, and I had just handed him a federal indictment on a silver platter. Caleb began to laugh. Caleb's laughter was a sharp, grating sound that shattered the absolute silence of the executive boardroom. It was not the desperate, broken laugh of a defeated man. It was the deeply arrogant, entirely confident sound of a predator who believed he still held the ultimate trump card. The older board members shifted nervously in their heavy leather chairs. Margaret narrowed her eyes, watching her favoured grandson with a sudden, sharp suspicion. You are incredibly thorough, Olivia, Caleb said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. He slowly reached into the interior pocket of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. You have woven a very impressive, very dramatic conspiracy theory. I applaud your theatricality. Unfortunately for you, it is entirely irrelevant. He pulled out a thick, legally bound document stamped with the gold seal of a prominent New York notary. Public. He slapped it down onto the center of the glass table, right next to my pristine toxicology report. This is a durable power of attorney for both healthcare and financial decisions, Caleb announced, looking directly at the shareholders. Julian signed it exactly 32 days ago. He knew his mind was failing. He knew he was losing his grip on reality. In a moment of clarity, he legally surrendered absolute control of his assets, his medical care, and his voting shares to me. Caleb turned to the security detail standing near the heavy double doors. Please escort my sister-in-law out of this building. She is causing a severe disruption to a private corporate transition. Isabella let out a loud, shuddering breath, a sudden spark of malicious hope lighting up her tear-stained face. She thought the golden cage had just been locked from the inside. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice or desperately appeal to Margaret. I simply looked at Julian. He sat perfectly still, his expression completely unbothered by the fake document his brother had just weaponized against him. I reached back into my red folder. A power of attorney is a fascinating legal instrument, I said, my voice cutting through the rising tension with the cold precision of a surgical scalpel. However, it only applies to assets that an individual legally controls. I pulled out the heavy, aged parchment bearing the original sterling crest. I placed it directly on top of Caleb's fake document. 30 years ago, your grandfather established an irrevocable trust, I explained, maintaining a perfectly steady cadence. It locked exactly 51% of the core corporate shares into a protective vault. Julian does not personally own those shares. The trust owns them, and an irrevocable trust completely nullifies any subsequent power of attorney regarding those assets. Caleb's confident smile instantly evaporated. Furthermore, I concluded, tapping the final signature line, any action regarding that trust requires 2 signatures, Julian's and his legally wedded wife's. Your document is completely useless paper. Caleb stared at the ancient parchment, his face turning an ashen, sickly white. The trap had permanently closed. Sirens wailed in the distance. The wail of the police sirens grew louder, echoing up from the Manhattan streets and vibrating against the thick glass windows of the boardroom. The illusion of the untouchable Sterling family was entirely shattered. 4 uniformed federal officers walked through the heavy double doors, accompanied by the lead corporate attorney. Margaret did not raise her voice to stop them. She simply gripped her silver cane, her face an unreadable mask of cold preservation. She had always favoured Caleb, but Margaret respected the survival of the empire above all else. Like a surgeon removing a gangrenous limb. She silently watched as the officers approached her grandson. Caleb did not fight. The arrogance had been completely drained from his body, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell of a man. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists. The golden boy of the Sterling family was now a federal criminal facing charges of attempted murder and massive corporate fraud. As the officers began to lead Caleb away, Isabella finally broke. The reality of her situation crashed down upon her with the weight of a collapsing building. She was legally tied to a man going to federal prison, and her name was signed on every single document connecting them to the illegal chemical purchases. She scrambled out of her chair and rushed toward me, her expensive emerald silk gown tangling around her ankles. She grabbed my sleeve, her manicured fingers digging desperately into my arm. "Olivia, please," Isabella sobbed, her voice high and entirely stripped of its usual pride. "You have to tell them. I did not know. You have to save me. We are twins. We shared a womb. We are blood. I just wanted to be loved and protected." I looked down at her hands gripping my suit jacket. I remembered the previous life. I remembered standing on the edge of a cold rooftop, listening to this exact same woman scream about how unfair the world was right before she dragged me down into the abyss. I reached out and slowly, firmly peeled her fingers off my sleeve. "You did not want love, Isabella," I said, my voice completely devoid of anger or pity. "You wanted a crown. You saw the ending you desired, but you completely refused to pay the toll required to reach it." She stared at me, tears ruining her meticulous makeup, her mouth trembling as she searched for another manipulative angle. There were none left. "I lent you my life in this timeline," I told her quietly, "but you had absolutely no idea how to live it." I turned my back on her weeping figure and walked toward the exit. Julian fell into step beside me, his presence a solid, impenetrable wall against the chaos of the room. We left the boardroom without looking back at the wreckage. 3 quiet months passed by. The morning sun poured through the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hamptons estate, painting the polished hardwood floors in warm, golden hues. The frantic, suffocating energy that had once choked the Sterling family dynamics was completely gone, replaced by a profound and steady peace. I stood in the kitchen, dressed in a simple cashmere sweater, watching the ocean waves crash rhythmically against the distant shoreline. Julian walked into the room. He was not wearing his usual armor of a tailored charcoal suit. He looked relaxed, the lingering grey pallor of the heavy metal poisoning completely erased from his features. He moved with a quiet purpose, retrieving the glass kettle from the counter. He did not call for Cora or any of the other household staff. He filled the kettle himself. He pulled out a digital culinary thermometer, measuring the water temperature until it hit exactly 190 degrees Fahrenheit, the precise temperature required to steep my preferred Earl Grey tea without burning the delicate leaves. It was a small, incredibly mundane action, but to me, it carried the weight of 1,000 grand romantic gestures. Isabella had chosen Caleb because she craved the loud, performative affection that looked beautiful in photographs but bruised her behind closed doors. She wanted passion, completely ignoring the fact that unchecked passion often burns the house down. Julian poured the steaming water into my porcelain cup and set it gently on the marble island in front of me. He did not ask for a parade of gratitude. He simply provided what was needed, with absolute accuracy and care. He slid a heavy manila envelope across the marble surface. I picked it up and broke the seal. Inside was a stack of legally binding financial transfers. Julian had formally separated my portion of the irrevocable trust, granting me absolute independent control over a massive block of corporate equity and liquid capital. "You secured the empire," Julian said, his voice deep and entirely sincere. You took the poison out of my cup when you had absolutely no obligation to care whether I lived or died. This capital is not a gift. It is compensation for services rendered, and an acknowledgement of an equal partnership. I looked at the documents, then up at his grey eyes. There were no invisible strings attached to this money. There were no emotional traps. I was entirely free. I had fought for my autonomy. And the man standing in front of me respected me enough to hand me the keys to my own kingdom. "Thank you, Julian," I said softly. He nodded once, a gesture of pure, unshakable respect. I walked out the door. The air in Midtown Manhattan was crisp and energized. I stepped out of my town car and looked up at the sleek, modern glass facade of the newly renovated office building. It was not a subsidiary of the Sterling Empire. It was an entirely independent entity, funded completely by my own capital. I pushed through the revolving doors and walked into the bright, expansive lobby of the Olivia Foster Foundation. I had specifically chosen to use my maiden name for the organization. The foundation was dedicated entirely to providing immediate, overwhelming legal and financial shields for victims of domestic and financial abuse. I had built a fortress for people like Cora, people who were trapped in impossible situations by powerful predators using money as a weapon. My lead legal director met me near the reception desk. We spent the morning reviewing case files, authorizing emergency medical trusts, and deploying aggressive legal retainers to sever the invisible chains holding our clients hostage. There was no screaming, no melodrama, just the quiet, methodical dismantling of abusers through superior financial firepower. Around noon, my executive assistant walked into my office carrying an absolutely massive floral arrangement composed entirely of rare white orchids. She set the heavy crystal vase carefully on the edge of my desk and handed me a small, embossed card. I opened the envelope. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and instantly recognizable. "Well played, Margaret." I stared at the note for a long moment. Margaret had spent her entire life rewarding women who played the victim, women who cried beautifully and manipulated through weakness. She had praised Isabella and dismissed my quiet strength. But Margaret ultimately respected power above all else. By dismantling Caleb's coup and securing the core shares of the empire, I had forced the ancient matriarch to bow to a woman who had never shed a single tear for her approval. I did not feel a rush of validation. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of closure. I dropped the small card directly into the paper shredder beside my desk. The machine hummed to life, reducing the matriarch's praise to narrow ribbons of confetti. I did not need the Sterling family to validate my existence. I did not need their legacy. I had successfully built my own empire, brick by logical brick, and I answered to no one but myself. I walked over to the expansive window, a cup of perfectly brewed tea in my hand. I looked at the city. The evening news played quietly on the television monitor in the corner of my office. The anchor's voice drifted through the room, detailing the latest developments in the massive corporate fraud scandal surrounding Caleb Sterling. Isabella's face flashed across the screen. She was exiting a federal courthouse, hiding her face behind a designer handbag. She had completely avoided prison time by cooperating with the authorities and testifying against Caleb. But the financial ruin was absolute. The government had seized her diamonds, her luxury vehicles, and all the properties linked to the shell companies. She was walking away with absolutely nothing. She had tried to steal my destiny, believing that choosing the right man at the right moment would guarantee a lifetime of effortless luxury. She had never understood that a successful life is not a prize you can simply inherit. It is a fortress you must continuously defend. I turned the monitor off. The screen faded to black, erasing Isabella from my reality permanently. Julian stepped into the office, carrying a pair of leather briefcases. We were scheduled to attend a private dinner to celebrate the launch of my new foundation. He did not rush me. He stood near the doorway, watching me with that familiar, steady gaze that always made me feel entirely grounded. In my past life, I had mistaken chaotic obsession for love. I had believed that if a man was frantically possessive, it meant I was incredibly valuable. Julian had taught me a fundamentally different truth. True love is not loud, frantic possession. True love is the quiet, unshakable safety of knowing your partner will not drop your hand when the storm hits. It is the mutual respect of two individuals who choose to stand together on a battlefield. I picked up my coat and walked toward him. We did not need to speak about the past anymore. The ghosts of the previous timeline had been thoroughly exorcised by facts, documents, and undeniable truth. Legacy is not what you magically inherit from the bloodlines of your ancestors. Legacy is the peace you violently protect, and the environment you carefully build for the people you choose to save. If this story proved to you that protecting your peace is the ultimate revenge, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, did Isabella truly deserve her fate? Julian held the door. The glass door clicked shut,